I think we'll get started for this presentation. But before I introduce Sean, who's going to introduce the guest speaker, I just want to point out that we have about 60 members, dues-paying members, and we're always looking for more members to help out. We have a fee of $10 for an individual for a year and $12 for a family. So if you're not a member right now, it would be very nice. We use that money to bring in speakers like Russ. And we have a wonderful website, fitchburghistory.org, but that also costs a little money. So we use the rest of our money for that. And almost everything else is done by volunteers. So without ado, I'm going to invite Sean Paff to introduce us.
Sure, thank you. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Sean Paff, member of the Fitchburg Historical Society. Glad you could join us on this Sunday before Veterans Day. We're really excited about our presentation today. We talked as a board about when we should have this event, and we decided on today for a lot of reasons because it's before Veterans Day. And I am someone who has worked downtown a lot in my career in the state capitol. I've always loved the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and especially the gift shop. And we thought as a group it would be a good idea to get somebody there as our close relationship with the State Veterans Museum to come and speak to us. So now that I'm in my early 50s, I need to use these. So anyway, today we're doing a program that's talking about finding those who served, military genealogy at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Would you like to know more about the veteran in your family tree? Join us this fall at our meeting. So that was the marketing we did. I want to thank Eileen and her team for that, and the Historical Society. Eileen does great work of getting our stuff out. If you saw the Fitchburg Star this month, we were on page 8. Great story about you coming, Russ, so a lot of hype here. The Wisconsin Veterans Museum is rooted in the 1901 founding of the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, Memorial Hall in the Wisconsin State Capitol. Beautiful room if you've been there, 4th floor hearing room in the West Wing. Today the museum has risen to become Wisconsin's premier military history museum and is a key educational activity of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. The museum staff showcases the stories of Wisconsin veterans of all branches from the U.S. Civil War to present, demonstrating the enduring relevance of every veteran experience. Galleries are open to the public during the operating hours. Research Center, where genealogists do research, is open by appointment, so folks can come in ahead and schedule their visits to do their own research with the help of great experts. And one of those experts, and someone who's a friend of Fitchburg, is Russ Horton. Russ is the reference and outreach archivist at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. He's been there for more than 20 years, and Russ is the son and grandson of Army veterans. He has worked at the museum for more than 20 years, as I said. In that time, he has helped thousands of genealogists and researchers learn more about Wisconsin veterans and their stories. As our Mayor, Julia Rattafrata, joins us, let's give a warm welcome to Russ Horton from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum.
All right. Is this good here? Oh, it is. Yeah, good. Thank you so much, Sean, for that kind introduction. I'm going to have to figure out where to hold my head so this picks up. Excellent. All right. So my name is Russ Horton. I'm the reference archivist at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd rather not hold it if I don't have to, but we'll see. It seems to be doing better now, huh? Okay, excellent. So, right, what I want to talk to you about today are the ways that you can learn more about veterans in your family or veterans in your community, using some of the resources we have at our museum, and pointing you toward resources that might be outside of our museum too. So I'm happy to present this information to you. I'm also going to have questions at the end, so if you think of something, don't be afraid to ask. All right. So I have been at this job for quite a while, and I think that in helping researchers and genealogists over the years, there are a lot of common questions that I get. These are questions that you all might have about your ancestors or people in your community. You might want to know details of their service. You might want to know if they were in any battles or if they were wounded. Did they earn any decorations or medals? You might have a family story that you've heard about someone, and you might want to know if that's true or more details about that. And then there might be things that you have from your ancestors or from veterans in your community, and you're not sure what they are or what they mean. So these are the common types of questions that I usually get. And I'm hoping that in this presentation today, I will be able to help you figure out how you might be able to answer these questions or point you toward the resources that can get you the answers that you're looking for. The first recommendation that I give to researchers who are trying to learn more about a veteran is to treat it as if you were doing research in a foreign country or with a foreign language. Have any of you done research, genealogy research or otherwise, in other countries? So what you discover is that other countries organize their information differently. Different terms might mean different things. So if you try to do it yourself, you might run into a brick wall or you might run down the wrong path. And that takes you away from the information that you're looking for. And the military is very similar. Words that mean one thing in the civilian world might mean something different in a military context. And you see a lot of abbreviations and acronyms and jargon that you might not know what they mean, like the ones I have on the screen right here. So the biggest suggestion that I can give at the very beginning here is to not try to do it yourself. If you look at an abbreviation or an acronym, like for instance, MOS, you might not have any idea what that means, but you might make an assumption like, oh, that must mean Master of Sergeants or something like that. And that's not a huge, I guess what I'm trying to say is that can take you down the wrong path and can make your research harder. So please don't try to do it yourself. Ask for help. We at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum have been helping researchers learn more about veterans for over 100 years, and we are here to help you. We can either find you an answer or point you in the right direction. So please don't be afraid to reach out to us. You do not have to come to the museum. I'm going to give contact information throughout this presentation. You can email us, you can call us. A couple people still write us letters. There's different ways you can get in touch with us. So please don't be afraid to reach out. Before I get into the materials that we have at our museum, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of our institution. As Sean mentioned, we started out as the GAR Memorial in 1901. Civil War veterans in the state wanted to make sure that the memory and the stories of their service would be remembered by future generations. So they had a room in the Capitol that was dedicated to that purpose. Here's a picture of that room. You can see those are Civil War veterans, some of the first curators of our museum. It started in 1901. It survived at least one Capitol fire. And over time, it grew to include more Civil War materials and start to incorporate things from the Spanish-American War and World War I. Right after World War II, the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs was formed as a state institution, and they were given charge of the GAR Memorial Hall. So at that point in 1945, it became part of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs, which we are still part of today. Into the 1970s and 80s, the Capitol decided that they wanted their room back, and frankly, the collection of the museum had outgrown the room that it was over in the Capitol. So we looked for a new location and moved across the street to where we are now at 30 West Mifflin Street. We opened there in 1993 as the Wisconsin Veterans Museum with an exhibit that spans the Civil War through the present. The research center where I work opened in 2001. If some of you have done research in archives before, archives are often in the basements of buildings. They're dark and dusty. Our research center is on the 3rd floor. You can see there's windows and everything. So it's a nice place to come in and do a little research if you want. Sean mentioned we are open by appointment only. So if you want to come in and do some research, please feel free to contact me and we can set up a time for you to come in and look at some materials that I'm going to be talking about today. The types of materials that we have in our collection that might be useful to you in your research, and I'll be talking about how these might be used. We have letters, diaries, and photographs from individual Wisconsin veterans. Now, I do want to make clear that unfortunately we don't have these materials from every Wisconsin veteran. Sometimes I think people have the idea that we're going to have a picture of every veteran, and they'll contact us and say, I want to see a picture of my ancestor who served in World War I, and we would love to have a picture of every veteran. But at this point, our collection is almost entirely based on donations. So when a veteran or their family makes the decision that they want to see that these materials are preserved for future generations, they reach out to us. If they donate the materials, they become part of our collection, and then we're able to share them with researchers moving forward. So we do have these materials from many veterans. We also have records and photographs from veterans organizations around the state. So these are things like GAR, Grand Army of the Republic posts, American Legion posts, VFW posts, et cetera. Again, we don't have them all. We have them when those groups decide to share their records with us. Military History Library that can provide a lot of contextual information. So if you're doing research on an individual who served in a particular unit or participated in a particular battle, we might have a history of that unit or a history of that battle that can help you better understand the topic. So we'll get into that a little more later too. We have an oral history program that has over 2,000 interviews with Wisconsin veterans, and I do want to put in a little plug for that. If any of you are veterans or any of you know veterans who might want to share their story, we do have an active oral history program that we encourage you to use. Our motto as a museum is that every veteran is a story. Sometimes people seem to have the assumption that we only want stories and materials from people who were in big battles or participated in historic events, but we believe that every person who served in the military deserves to have that story preserved. So no matter what someone did, if they served stateside or overseas, if they were in battles, or if they sat behind a desk, we want to preserve that story. So something to think about, reach out to us or have the veteran reach out to us if they might want to participate.
And then again, we have staff who know this material and know the topic backwards and forwards. So that's another really good resource at our museum.
This is our website. If technology cooperates, I will be using it as I go throughout this presentation to show you some of the resources that we have on here, but please feel free to check out our website. Address is there, but if you just search
for Wisconsin Veterans Museum, you will find us very quickly. Okay, how are we doing so far?
Great.
Any questions before I get into the material here?
Russ, are you funded by the state? How are we?
Yep, yeah, so we're part of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. Almost all of our funding comes through them. We like to think of ourselves as a benefit. You know, the Department of Veterans Affairs provides benefits to vets. You know, going back to World War II, the GI Bill, like education benefits, medical benefits, et cetera. We like to think of ourselves as the benefit of legacy. We help make sure that the veterans' service is remembered for them and their families. Yes?
Excuse me for the very basic question, but what makes a veteran a Wisconsin veteran versus an Illinois veteran or a Minnesota veteran, or maybe they lived in several states?
Sure. That's a very good question. We try to cast the net as widely as we can. So our definition of a Wisconsin veteran is someone who was born in this state or who joined the military in this state or who has lived in this state for at least 5 years. So as long as someone meets one of those criteria, we would consider them a Wisconsin veteran, and we would be happy to talk about preserving their story. We do get questions sometimes from folks who live in Wisconsin now, who say, I've got my mother's World War II materials. Do you want to, and we find out that
So unfortunately, we can't accept that. But yeah, we try to find any connection to Wisconsin that we can. Okay, so I am going to go through, again, our collection starts at the Civil War. That's the first conflict after Wisconsin became a state. Our museum was started by Civil War vets, so that's kind of where we start. We can hopefully help you find some information about War of 1812 or Revolutionary War vets, but it's not really in our collection, so most of the time we're going to point you toward other resources for that. I want to just kind of go through conflict by conflict and talk about the resources we have, some of the ways that you might find out more information about veterans who participated in these conflicts. And then we'll go from there. So Civil War, 1861 to 1865, Wisconsin sent about 80,000 men to fight in the Civil War. And again, the question that you just asked becomes really interesting because this database that I'm going to show you has information about the 80,000 men who were living in Wisconsin at the time of their service. There are a lot of veterans, probably some in Fitchburg here, who maybe lived in New York or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania during the Civil War and moved here afterwards and lived here for 70 years and are buried here. They're not going to show up in this database. Civil War records tend to be stored in the state where the service took place, or the state for which the service took place, okay? So if your ancestor moved here afterwards, you're going to want to go to Pennsylvania to find those Civil War records. But what we have is a searchable online database, 80,000 Wisconsin men who served in the Civil War. I'm going to take a chance here and get out of this and take you to our website. So again, this is our website. Most of the resources that I'm going to be talking about today are going to be under this Learning and Research tab.
So this Learning and Research tab is where you're going to find the resources that I'm talking about today. Over on the right-hand side, we have our different rosters for the Civil War, the Spanish-American Wars, World War I. I'll talk about the other ones in turn, but right now we're going to look at the Civil War roster. Again, this has information about those 80,000 Wisconsin men. The nice thing about this database is that you can search a lot of different ways. So if you're interested in an individual, you can search for them by name. If you're interested in your community's contributions to the Civil War, you can search by their residence. If you're interested in a particular unit, you can go that way too. The one piece of advice that I always give to people who are searching this database, or really any other database, is that you can't impress a database. A lot of people I have found will try to fill in every single one of these fields and search, and then they get 0 results and they wonder why. And it's because if any one of the pieces of information that you put into these fields is not correct or doesn't match what we have in the database, it's going to pull 0 results. So I recommend very strongly that you start by just searching a last name. 80,000 results sounds like a whole lot, but it's not really in the long run. And unless you're talking about a last name like Smith or Johnson, you're probably not going to get all that many results, so it's easy to just skim through. So for instance, I'm going to put in my last name here and hit search. And I'm just going to scroll down to see the number of results here. We got 37 results. So it's not the end of the world to scroll through 37 results to try to find your ancestor. This is just for the Civil War, that's correct. If you do get too many results, I think you can add in a first name, and that'll narrow it down even further. But I would really recommend not trying the other fields if you're searching for an individual, unless it's really necessary. And there is someone who had my name who served in the Civil War from Wisconsin, although as far as I can tell, I don't have any ancestors who served in the Civil War, which is ironic given my job. But when you do find individuals in here, the information it's going to give you, and this is just a starting point, it's going to tell you roughly where they were living, the regiment that they served in, which is very important, the company they were in, when they enlisted, when they got out, and then this remarks field that talks about if they were promoted or if they transferred or if they were wounded or taken prisoner, those sorts of things. This is just kind of basic starting information, but it's the information that you get here is going to allow you to search other places to get. Before I get back to my PowerPoint, I just want to try to put in Fitchburg here and see what happens. One of the things that I would say is that the residence field for the Civil War in particular is not always super accurate. A lot of times people, if you think about the 1860s, there is a guy sitting behind a desk asking the people who are coming up and enlisting, where do you live? What's your name? So names get misspelled. Depending on what they say might say the nearest post office, they might say the nearest big city. So you have to take the residence field with a grain of salt. But for Fitchburg, for what it's worth, we get 105 results. Some of those are going to be repetitive. So like here we have Mortimer Beals,
who transferred companies. So he's in there twice. So it's not 105 individuals, it's 105 records. The last thing I want to mention about this database is you don't have to type in whole words. So we live in Wisconsin. There are a lot of immigrants here from European countries in the 1860s. We've got Germans coming in, we've got Irish coming in. Those names get butchered. If any of you have done research on especially German ancestors from the 1860s, it can be impossible to find the name spelled the same way more than once, right? So you don't have to put in a whole name on here. And again, that's where kind of the skimming thing will come in. If your name started with SCHA, and then it kind of gets a little fishy after that, just put in SCHA. And if their name is sometimes John and sometimes Johann, you can just put in JOH and hit search. And then you get this list that, again, you can just kind of skim through and find out, oh, yep, that's the one. That's close enough to what I'm looking for. I think that's, or I've seen it spelled that way before. So there's some flexibility here. And I really encourage you, though, if you're having trouble finding someone in here and you really think they should be in there, just reach out to us. Again, there's a lot of names that get misspelled.
Russ, if you clicked on Johann Schrader, and is there a toggle there where a picture or information would pop? Does it populate on those things, or just like a list like that?
That's a really good question. We don't have anything like that quite yet, but if you do find the name that you're looking for and click on this Request More Info tab, this will send us an email that tells us you're interested in that individual, and then we can let you know what else we have on them. Thank you for asking that question. So that's the thing to do, is click the Request More Info tab, which will, good segue here. Once we know that it's working, or once we know that the individual's in the database, that's kind of the big thing for us, is figuring out if they're in the database. That means we're going to probably have more information about them. And that information is going to come from what are called the muster and descriptive roles. These are books that the state of Wisconsin generated after the Civil War was done. They gathered up all the reports that the Army generated and summarized them into these giant red and blue books. We don't have the original books, but we have them on microfilm, which is a super fun way to do research. Now, the thing with the Civil War is these books are organized by regiment. So they're not organized alphabetically by surname or anything like that. It's 1st Regiment, 2nd Regiment, 3rd Regiment, and then under that by company. So knowing the regiment and the company that your ancestor served in is a super important piece of information to find more. So going back to our database, that was one of the pieces of information we got from there, right, was the regiment and the company. Once we have that information, we can find them in the muster and descriptive roles. This is an example of what that might look like, and we can provide you with a copy of this, or you can set up an appointment to come in and look at it yourself. So for this individual, you've got their name, their rank, where and when they enlisted, and then way over on the right-hand side, you've got their age, MS's marital status, eye color, hair color, complexion, height, and occupation, which is kind of interesting information to have about someone who lived over 160 years ago, right? How tall they were, what color their eyes were, especially if it's an ancestor, right? Now, for whatever reason, I do have to say, not every soldier has every single one of these fields filled in. I do not know the reason for that. They just must not have had it in their records when these books were being compiled. So I want to show you the type of information that could be in here, but I don't want to get your hopes up too high just in case your ancestor is one of the few who doesn't have it all filled in. But this is the type of information that is going to be in these roles. I see a question over here.
Yeah, I have a question. So these books were created about 2 years after the Civil War. What if, like, your ancestor had passed away between the Civil War ending and these books were created? Could they have been forgotten off of them?
It's possible. So they're the red and the blue books. So the red books were created right after the Civil War. The blue books were created in the 1880s, so about 20 years after the Civil War. And we generally use the blue books just because there was more time for them to find more records and gain more information. There are certainly individuals who do get omitted out of here, and there are other resources we can look into to try to find them then. But in my experience, there aren't many people who were left out of here. Again, because they used the records from the war. So even if someone died right after the war, they still would show up in those wartime records. So it should be pretty accurate. So this is the first page of the red and the blue books. This is the second page, and this is, I picked an example that had a lot of information. So this is not a typical record, but on here we have where they were living at the time of their service, their residence, where they were credited to for draft purposes, which is a whole nother thing, and then a remarks field, which goes into a lot more detail than the one on our database about what they were doing if they were detached for service to another unit, if they were sick in a hospital, it'll kind of track that. This will go into detail about wounds, so it won't just say wounded, it will often say gunshot wound to right shoulder kind of thing. Again, this is a very extreme example. This is someone who saw some pretty interesting service. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 lines because nothing out of the ordinary happened in their service, and it might just say enlisted on this date, served in these couple battles, and was mustered out with their company. So it runs the gamut there in terms of length and depth of information, but this is the type of information that you might be getting. Yes?
Quick question, what does muster mean?
So mustering is kind of, it's another word for joining the military, kind of joining the unit. Yep. So on here you can see it says enlisted and it says mustered U.S. service. So enlisting is going to your local center and saying, I want to join the Army. Sometimes they would go, usually they would go to Camp Randall to train, and then after a certain amount of time, a federal agent would come in and officially muster them into U.S. service. Especially in the beginning of the war, these dates are going to often be different, but once the war went on and we just needed to be cranking out soldiers to fight in the Civil War, those dates get a whole lot closer. And often they were enlisted and mustered in on the same day. It's kind of a technicality. It's not anything to get too worked up about. If you find your person in our database, this is an option. Again, you can come in to look at it with an appointment, or we do offer to send a copy of this via email or regular mail. I think we charge $5 for a copy of this. We do also produce a certificate of service for the Civil War, which summarizes their service in different ways. It'll give you a lot of the same information in terms of when they enlisted and when they got out. And then it has a list of the battles that they served in, as well as a regimental history to give you an idea of what their regiment was doing throughout the war. I think that's $10 for this. So those are some options for learning more about Civil War veterans. And again, I mentioned earlier, we've got the library as well, which can contain contextual information for learning more about the battles they served in or the units they were with, or all that sort of stuff.
So with that, could you go in and say Gettysburg, and it populates 3,000 Wisconsinites or whatever served, or Bull Run or whatever?
No, you can't search by battle. No, at least not yet. That's something we can kind of work on, but no. You could look at the units that served in those battles. So like at Gettysburg, I think there were 4 or 5 Wisconsin regiments that served there, and then you could search those regiments and kind of get the information that way. But okay, moving on from the Civil War, next we have the Spanish-American War. How many of you have researched an ancestor who served in the Spanish-American War? Oh, 2 people raised their hand. Usually it's none. You guys kind of ruined that. It's often a big difference between the Civil War, interest in the Civil War, right, and interest in the Spanish-American War. 80,000 Wisconsin soldiers served in the Civil War, about 4,000 served in the Spanish-American War. So there is a big difference there. I do want to mention one of those things I talked about at the beginning, where if you don't ask for help, you might get down the wrong path. So the Spanish-American War was a conflict in which the United States fought against Spain. That makes sense, right? It lasted about 3 months. It was fought almost entirely in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico and Cuba and places like that. There's another conflict that the United States participated in immediately after the Spanish-American War, called the Philippine-American War, but it often gets lumped in with the Spanish-American War. So this database is only going to search the war with Spain, which is about 4,000 Wisconsin troops. Sometimes people will contact me and say, my ancestor isn't in this database. I know they served in the Spanish-American War. Why aren't they in here? And when I start asking them some more questions, they'll say, oh, he served in the Philippines. And that's why he's not showing up in here, because this does not cover the Philippine-American War. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of understanding the conflicts and the context and all of that. So in the Spanish-American War, the Wisconsin National Guard, which was kind of a new organization was called up into service. 4 regiments served, and that is roughly 4,000 men from Wisconsin who served in the Spanish-American War. The database is similar. You can search by their name or their unit, city. This one does have a county as well that you can search by. And if you find your ancestor in this database, we actually have the originals of these. Very similar to the muster and descriptive rolls. These are called muster cards. But you can see that it has the same type of information, their age and height and complexion. This one has where they were born, which is interesting. And then the general service information. The back of the card on the right side has that kind of remarks field. Now in the Spanish-American War, I think 134 Wisconsin men died in the Spanish-American War. Only 2 of them were killed in action. The rest died of disease. So on the back of these cards, you will often see sick with malaria, died of typhoid, and those sorts of things. So that's one of the stories of the Spanish-American War. I do want to mention too, I forgot to do this with the Civil War. A common question that we get from folks is, hey, does it list their spouse? Does it list their parents? Does it list their kids? Unfortunately, no, it does not. So if you're wondering, like, this is not a good example because it's not a common name, but if we have 18 John Smiths in our database and you're wondering which one is yours, unfortunately, we can't look in our records and see who his parents were or who his spouse was or who his kids were to help you figure out if it's your John Smith. The military at this point in time at least was not interested in that information. You have a question?
I see this guy changed his name. If you're looking in the database, which name would it come up under?
That is a really good question. My guess is that it would come up under the handwritten name, but we can search both ways. That's a really good question. So again, you can tell that this is probably someone who immigrated from Europe. And as I mentioned with the Civil War, that can cause a lot of issues with how it gets spelled in these databases. Sometimes they said their name to that person sitting behind the desk and that person spelled it as best they could. Often they would adopt more Americanized names. So that's a good question. The names do present some issues, but again, we can kind of search for different ways there, or search different ways. Okay, Spanish-American War, I don't spend a whole lot of time on just because not a lot of people are usually very interested in it, but please feel free to come up afterwards and ask me if you have questions about that conflict. The next one I want to talk about briefly is called the Mexican Expedition. You might hear it talked about as the Pancho Villa expedition or the punitive expedition into Mexico. This is 1916. There's a revolution happening in Mexico. A revolutionary leader named Pancho Villa goes a little north of the border and kills some American citizens in Texas, which causes President Woodrow Wilson to call up the Army and the National Guard to catch Pancho Villa, basically. Wisconsin National Guard was called up and was sent down to San Antonio. We have the records for that call up. Again, this is going to be about 4,000 or 5,000 men. They did not see any action. They just did some training exercises in San Antonio. Basically, the National Guard protected the southern border of the U.S. while the regular army went into Mexico. This is not to be confused with the Mexican-American War, which happened in the 1840s. This is 1916, and it's the Mexican Expedition. The interesting thing about this is 1916. These guys went down to Texas. They came back to Wisconsin in early 1917, and a couple of months later, the U.S. entered World War I, and almost all of these men were called up into service in World War I. So if you have an ancestor who served in the 32nd Division in World War I, there's a pretty good chance they're going to show up in these records too. The interesting thing about these records is for the first time, they do list next of kin way over on the right-hand side. So this might be their parent or their spouse or a sibling or something like that, if that's information that interests you. All right, so next, World War I. So this is just a little over 100 years ago, right? 122,000 Wisconsin men and women served in World War I. This is the first conflict where women were able to be a part of the active military. And about 4,000 Wisconsin women served in World War I. We do have this database. It's very similar to the other ones that I've been showing you, searchable by the same kind of ways. And I don't know, do you want me to go into this one? Or maybe I'll just poke in a little bit. We'll test the, oh no, I shouldn't have said that. Never mind, we're gonna stay with the presentation here. Well, it's not going to the other screen, so I just don't want to push my luck here. We can look at it maybe afterwards, but the database operates the exact same way as the Civil War one did. You can search by name, you can search by city or county, and it'll bring up the information just like it did last time. So again, this is going to be men and women who were living in Wisconsin at the time that they joined the service. Same kind of deal. If they were living elsewhere but moved to Wisconsin afterwards, they're not going to show up in these records or in this database. If you find a name in this database, it means that we're going to have what we call service cards. These were generated by the Adjutant General's office. Usually the top card was more the state Adjutant General. The bottom card is more the federal Adjutant General. This is, again, a kind of a typical example. They're not all going to look exactly like this, but this is generally how they look. The top card is going to be a lot more personal information. You'll see that they've got the physical description at the very top and the age and when they enlisted and all of that. The bottom card is going to have a lot more specific military information. So it tracks their organizations. So if they served in several different units, it's going to track all of that. It will track the ranks that they held throughout their service. It will list any battles that they served in. Interestingly, if they served overseas, if they deployed to Europe, it'll tell you when they went overseas, they came back. If they were wounded, it will list that as well. And then on the back of the cards, usually it repeats the campaigns that they served in. If they did receive any awards, military decorations, it'll list them there too. So I see that there's a whole bunch of military awards over there. So I do want to say that for World War I and backwards, there were not a lot of military awards available. So for the Civil War in particular, you're not going to find a lot of evidence of awards outside of a Medal of Honor. For World War I, you've got the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star. I think those were kind of the big ones. The Purple Heart did not exist at the time of World War I. So if a World War I veteran was wounded, once the Purple Heart was instituted in the 1930s, they could apply for one retroactively, but you will not find any mention of a Purple Heart on a World War I record because it just didn't exist as an award. In World War I, you will sometimes find foreign awards, so the governments of France and Belgium and other countries would sometimes give awards to American soldiers if they felt they warranted them. So this individual received a Croix de Guerre from France for some things that he did in battle. Again, this is for the people that we can find in our database who were living in Wisconsin at the time of service. Do produce a World War I certificate of service that is going to have the same information that was on this card. It's just prettier and has a graphic. So same information, just a little bit of a different format. All right. Zoom in through here. I'm just kind of see what time it is. Any questions up to World War I? Because this is where it starts becoming a little bit different when we do World War II to the present. Everyone doing okay? All right. So for World War II to the present, you're going to want to look for this document. You might hear it called a DD-214. You might hear it called or an honorable separation record, but this is the descendant of all the records that I've been showing you up to this point. It has the same type of information with the physical description, with the unit they served in, and awards and citations and battles and all of that. This is the piece of information that you want to find to start learning about a veteran of World War II to the present. The problem is that this is where you start running into confidentiality laws. In the state of Wisconsin, there is a statute that protects veterans' records. And It's State Statute 45.04. It's worded very specifically.
In that, in Wisconsin, veterans' records are restricted to the veteran themselves.
If the veteran is deceased, it is restricted to their spouse or their adult children. And the statute specifically names spouse or adult children. It doesn't say next of kin. It doesn't say relatives. It says that. And because that's the way the statute's written, that's how it has to be enforced. So we have a lot of people contact us and say,
this veteran never married. This veteran didn't have any children.
But unfortunately, the statute's written the way that it's written. So these records are still held by the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. We do not have them at our museum, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't get you these records. So it presents a challenge for genealogists who want to learn about an ancestor who maybe wasn't their parent. But it gets tricky. So what I want to tell you are some ways you can still do this research. And I want to mention that the reason I'm not talking about the National Archives for World War II is because they had this huge fire in the 1970s that destroyed a lot of their Army records. So in 1973, they had this fire. I think records from between 1910 and 1960 were destroyed, almost 90% of them. So if you write the National Archives and ask for a World War II record, they're almost certainly going to tell you that it was destroyed in the fire. They are working to recreate those records and find them in other places. So more people are starting to get positive responses from the National Archives, but it's still not a great place to get that info. So the state becomes the place to get that info. So what do you do when you need to get the record from the state, but the state says you can't have it, right? So you can try to find the spouse or the adult child of the veteran and have them request the record. The other thing that I have found that works a lot is, especially for World War II, but also for the subsequent conflicts, when people left the service, they were strongly encouraged to give a copy of their discharge form to the county, so that it would be on file. If they ever lost theirs and needed a copy to apply for benefits or something like that, they could just go to the County Register of Deeds and get a copy and go from there. So if you know where a World War II veteran was living at the time of their service, if you know what county they were living in, there's a really good chance that that County Register of Deeds is going to have a copy of their discharge form. This is being recorded and I shouldn't be talking about this, but in theory, the County Register of Deeds is beholden to the same state statute that will stop WDVA from giving these records to you. What I have heard from genealogists and researchers is that county registers of deed are often willing to work with you a little more and might give you a redacted record, or maybe cross out the Army serial number at the top to show you, or just answer the questions that you have. So researching a World War II vet and you're having trouble getting their service record, I would recommend that you try a county register of deeds and go that route. I've heard of many success stories from that way. Now, the last thing I want to say is when I started working at the museum, World War I records were still protected under the same statute. And as near as I can tell, when the last World War I veteran in the state passed away, that is when I was told those records are open now, you can share them with people. So my guess is that it's not going to be until the last World War II veteran in Wisconsin passes away that these records are going to be opened up. So it could still be a little while. All right, any questions there for World War II? Yes.
Well, it kind of goes to World War I too. You said that archive burned in like 2018?
1970.
Burned in 1973, I think.
But it had records back to 1918.
Yeah, the records between 1910 and 1960 were destroyed. Yep. So again, with World War I as well, if you asked for records from the National Archives, they're probably going to say, we don't have any. But we still have them on the state level. So that's where the state comes in. Yes, sir.
For veterans who served, let's say, 1946 to 48, like my father, would that be in that database at all?
So same kind of deal. It's post-World War II. So the Department of Veterans Affairs probably has a copy of his discharge. And since it's your dad, you could ask them for it for sure. Yep. Basically, the way that the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs gets copies of these is when veterans apply for benefits. So the slight little change from World War I and back, where it was super important to know where they were living at the time they enlisted, for World War II to the present, at least from the state Veterans Affairs, you almost kind of want to think about where might they have applied for veterans benefits, all right? So if they were living in Wisconsin at the time they joined for World War II, but after the war they almost immediately moved out west to California or Washington or Oregon, you might want to look out there because that might be where they applied for the GI Bill.
Other states have this type of organization?
Every state has a Department of Veterans Affairs, yes. And that would be a good place to start.
That raises a good question, Russ. How do you guys cross-communicate, like Missouri veterans? Do you guys talk to each other, the different states? I mean, do you have colleagues, or do you share a database? Or if there's a African-American Veterans Museum, how do you talk to each other around the country so we can, to this gentleman's question, maybe he could.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the state departments of Veterans Affairs probably communicate. That's a little above my pay grade.
In terms of a museum, like
But the databases can they talk to each other, kind of, so to speak?
Yeah, so like the databases that we have at our museum are ones that we created and they're up there that anyone can use. There aren't a lot of other states that have veterans museums like us. We are a fairly unique institution. We're starting to see them pop up. I think California has one, I think New York has one, but most states who have military type museums, they're either focused on their National Guard, or they're focused on a battle or a branch of service or a particular conflict. Ours is one of the few that kind of spans multiple conflicts, multiple branches of service, et cetera. So,
as much as possible, we try to cooperate. I think Minnesota might be building one now too.
As much as we can, we do try to cooperate. Like I said, if we don't have an answer for you, we're going to try to point you to one of those other places that might have the answer. So,
we're not in the island by any stretch, but there's always room for improvements in terms of cooperation and that sort of thing, for sure.
Did I answer your question, sir? Enough? Okay. Any other questions at this point?
Well, I got one back to the Civil War.
Sure.
So what's the difference between, I found an ancestor of my wife on the Civil War of the Historical Society. But so what's the difference between searching at the State Historical Society and your records? And I just searched on my phone and he's not in your record.
He's not in our records?
Yeah, but he's in this, so I'm gonna have to double check that.
Yeah, I would maybe send me the links to what you're finding there. In theory, it should be the exact same. We're both using the same 1912 Civil War roster.
So we should have the same information. Honestly, I think the difference is that if you ask them for a copy of the muster and descriptor roll, they're going to charge you more than us. Yeah, I think that's kind of the difference. But it should be the same information for sure. Yeah. I see.
So my dad was born in Germany, moved to Milwaukee when he was 5, was in the army and a medic in England. But is there a way to find out where he was in England?
So that can get really tricky. I don't know how well you guys can see. This is kind of a typical DD-214. It's going to look pretty similar for subsequent conflicts too. This does not get down to the day-by-day level that a lot of people seem to want. We get a lot of questions of like, I'm going to France, I want to trace my ancestors' path through France. It's certainly doable, but it can take a lot more than this to do that. So what this might show is the unit that your father served in, and then we could research that unit and kind of see where in England they were stationed. So that's one way we could tackle it. But again, this record and the same one for Civil War, World War I, et cetera, this is often kind of a starting point that's going to give you a lot of info that you can use to then go find other sources, especially the unit and when they were overseas and the conflicts that they served in. Those are all pieces of information we can use to try to find other sources to get even more info.
That makes sense. All right.
So, moving on, I just want to talk a little bit about our sources, how they can be helpful too. So I mentioned that we have a lot of letters. I do want to stress this is not how we store them. This is how we usually get them. We store our letters in acid-free boxes, acid-free folders, all that. But what I want to do is kind of introduce the idea of what we call parallel research. Okay, so we have a lot of letters from a lot of men and women who served in a lot of conflicts. We might not have letters from the person that you're interested in. But that doesn't mean that the letters can't be a resource that you use. So parallel research is the idea that if someone served in the same unit as your ancestor, or if someone had the same military occupation as your ancestor, reading about that person's experiences can shed a lot of light on what your ancestor experienced. So if someone was in the same unit, they ate the same food, experienced the same weather, fought in the same battles, etc. So reading about what a different person experienced in the same unit can give you a feel for what your ancestor experienced. And same kind of thing if your ancestor was a medic in the Army in World War II, reading letters that another Army
medic in World War II can give you some insight into
what your ancestor experienced. So just because we don't have specific items, letters or papers or photographs from your ancestor doesn't mean that it might not be useful to you in your research. We also have images, I mentioned. Images can be a good source of information, believe it or not. So I have two images up here. The one on the left is a Civil War tintype. It might not look like a whole lot to you, but because we do this all the time and we study all of this type of stuff, we can tell you that the gentleman on the left is wearing a 5-button sack coat, and this is a coat that was issued in a very short period to only Wisconsin soldiers during the Civil War. So just by seeing this image and looking at this coat, we can narrow down from 80,000 men to about 4 or 5 regiments, about 4,000 or 5,000 men, who this might be. And this tracks back even further to what I was saying about asking for help, right? Like, you might see this image and not think a whole lot of it, but show it to us and we can tell you, oh, that's a 5-button sack coat. This person served in one of these 5 units, right? So don't underestimate images as a source of information. The guy on the right is a World War II soldier. You can see on his left shoulder, he's got a divisional patch. So patches and ribbons and medals and rank insignia, those are all things that might also give us clues as to what this person might have done or what unit they served in or where they served, those sorts of things. So if you have pictures of veterans in uniform particularly, those can be potential sources of information too, if you ask for help. All right, I mentioned our library. We have memoirs, reminiscences, published letters. Again, with the idea of parallel research, that even if we don't have them from your ancestor, we might have books from people who did similar things to your ancestors in the service, and that can help you learn more. I mentioned the oral history program. Same deal, listening to someone talk about their experiences as a helicopter gunner in Vietnam.
If your ancestor was also a helicopter gunner in Vietnam, that can really give some insight into all of it.
Are those online so we could find those or no?
A lot of, with the oral history program,
if you look at our catalog, and I'll show you the catalog in just a little bit, all of them should be cataloged online. In terms of the interview itself, many, if not most of them are online, both as the recording and as a transcript. So you should be able to see most of them online too. Yes.
So that's an option. I just wanted to mention our website again. Again, check it out. You can
not only find the resources that I've been talking about today, but since we're in Fitchburg and we're local here, it talks about the events we're having, talks about the exhibits that we have if you want to come. The Civil War tintype, finding out more about it might not individuals who served in the military. The Wisconsin Historical Society is a fantastic resource. They have a lot of information about all of this as well. Public libraries are, as we're standing here in one, public libraries often have information about local veterans. here talking to you for the Fitchburg Historical Society. County and community historical societies and genealogical societies often have compiled information about local veterans that can make it a lot easier for you to find quickly. I do want to mention obituaries. I work with a lot of genealogists, and I'm always surprised at how few of them have found an obituary for an ancestor who served particularly in, like, say, the Civil War or World War I. Obituaries can be a really good source of starting information for learning about a veteran. It will often mention the unit they served in, or at least the branch of service, and that can sometimes be more than you already had. So his left shoulder, he's got a divisional patch. So patches are a really great resource. During times of war, local newspapers love to print articles about local men and women in the service, about them getting promotions, about them changing units. Sometimes when they wrote letters home to their parents, the newspaper would print the whole letter. Those can be potential sources of information too, if you ask for help.
Newspapers as well.
All right, I mentioned our library. We have memoirs, reminiscences, published letters.
How many of you use
Again, with the idea of parallel research, that even if we don't have them from your ancestor, we might have books from people who did similar things to your ancestors in the service, and that can help learn more.
Researchers and genealogists.
I mentioned the oral history program. Same deal. Listening to someone talk about
Is as
a helicopter gunner in Vietnam.
if your ancestor was also a helicopter gunner in Vietnam, that can.
Ancestry.com has the index to Civil War pensions, okay? When a Civil War soldier applied for a pension, they had to basically justify to the government why they should be getting a pension. So they had to write a ton of letters about what happened to them, how they were injured or how they got sick and how it's affecting them in their current life. They had to get corroboration from people who served with them or from doctors who said, yep, I remember he was shot in the leg, or in a doctor who says, yep, it's still bothering him, it's still affecting his ability to get work. Pension records can be a wonderful resource for finding out about Civil War veterans. And if you go to Ancestry.com, you will find that they have an index to pension records. All that does is tell you whether or not there is a pension record at the National Archives. You still have to order the pension record from the National Archives, but a lot of genealogists who I talk to don't read the fine print on Ancestry to see that it's just an index. It might not look like about individuals who served in the military. The Wisconsin Historical Society is a fantastic, but all it says on Ancestry is basically, I mean, it says their unit and that there is a pension record there. So understanding what you're looking at is important. The other one is World War I draft registration cards. So in World War I, 12 million people registered for the draft. I don't remember the number anymore. A large number of men had to register for the draft in World War I. Only about 1/8 of them were actually drafted. So if you go to Ancestry.com, you can often find World War I draft registration cards. A lot of folks see that and they think, oh, this means my ancestor served in World War I. Why isn't he in your database? All that means is that he registered for the draft. It doesn't mean that he was actually drafted, and actually the chances are he wasn't drafted because only 1 out of 8 men were actually drafted. So again, when you find information online, especially on Ancestry, so patches and ribbons and that you're seeing, so that it doesn't send you down a wrong path or make you about them changing units. Sometimes when they wrote letters home to their parents, the newspaper would print the whole letter. This is like one of the biggest things I want to get through to you guys. And it's because it affects research, right? So like I talked about newspapers being a great source of information. I will tell people like, hey, why don't you check out newspapers from his hometown, ancestor, we might have books from people who did similar things to your ancestors. Not every newspaper is online. A lot of them are. But not only is not every newspaper online, but again, if you make sure you understand what it is you're looking at, sometimes these sites like newspaper.com or Newspaper Archive will have the newspaper you want, but they only have it from 1956 to 1963, and you really want the 1970s. So if you don't look at the site to see what kind of run they have, okay, when a Civil War soldier applied for a pension, they had to basically justify to the government why they should be getting a pension. So they had to write a ton of, you can't rely on the internet for all of the information that you want. You still are going to have to contact archives, contact museums, contact libraries to see what they might have that isn't online that might be of interest to you. At work, pension records can be a wonderful resource for finding out about Civil War veterans. And if you go to ancestry.com, you will find that they have an indexed pension records. Buy into family lore a little too hard. And then when we start doing the research and finding the documentation, find out that the family lore is not correct. It can get sometimes, I think. So the thing I would just tell you is that almost all family lore starts out with a grain of truth. But the longer it's been since that event happened, the more chance that it might not look like about individuals who served in the military. The Wisconsin Historical Society is a fantastic. Maybe everything isn't going to be exactly the way that your grandfather told you, and that's okay. It's human nature to kind of embellish over time, but we want to find the truth as researchers, so we should be prepared that maybe what we want to find isn't what we do find. Okay, here's all my contact info. I have some business cards in the back on the table too, if you guys want to contact me down the road. I do want to stress again, you don't have to come to the museum to use our resources. Feel free to email us or look at our website. But I'd be happy to answer any other questions you guys have here at the end.
Question.
The archives that you have, do you have information about the Wisconsin Veterans and Orphans Home from the Civil War?
We don't have, I think we have a picture of the orphanage, but no, technically that was a civilian operation. So those I think would be at the Wisconsin Historical Society.
And just going off of that, General Bitliff from the Civil War was the person who was on the board for that. Do you have any records from him?
If he's, well, I was gonna, it's working again, excellent. So I want to show you guys just quick our catalog here. So if you go to that Learning and Research tab, for our archives, you just want to go to Search Archives. You can search a bunch of different ways here. One thing I'll tell you is another quick tip, I guess, for using these things. Keyword is almost always better to use than subject. Okay, subject is going to search, this is getting into the weeds here, but Library of Congress subject headings. Sometimes these sites like newspaper.com or Newspaper Archive will have the newspaper you want, but they only have it from 1956 to 1963, and you really want the 1970s. So if you don't look at the site to see what kind of run they have,
BINTLIFF.
Okay. That name does not sound super. When a Civil War soldier applied for a pension, they had, we'd have, if he served in a Wisconsin unit, we'd have that muster and descriptor role for him. But in terms of like personal papers and letters, it doesn't look like we have it. You can use this catalog to search for archives, contact museums, contact libraries to see what they might have that isn't online that might be of interest to you. World War II letters. So I searched his last name, and if we do have something, you're going to find something like this. It's just a catalog record, and it's going to give you an abstract that talks a little bit about what's in the collection. All that buy into family lore a little too hard. And then when we start doing the woman who would become my grandmother, little info about what's covered in the letters. So that would be kind of the first step. And then if you found that we had letters that you were interested in, whether they're from your ancestor or not, then you'd contact us to make an appointment to come in and see them, or to, if you're not able to come into Madison, to say, hey, these sound super interesting. Is it possible to get some scans of some of these? We can help you that way.
Russ, we have a wonderful Veterans Park just down here, and Mike Croft, one of our Historical Society members, very involved in that. Could you pull up just a name for us, maybe a Fitchburg name? Robert Schley.
In one of the databases?
Yeah, in Vietnam database.
So we don't have a Vietnam database. Because the records from World War II to the present are still confidential, we can't get access to them, which means we can't create a database for them.
Either then. What's that? You can't with World War II then either, correct?
Correct, yep. We'd love to make a World War II database, but we don't have access to the records yet, unfortunately. Now that being said, if you have questions about World War II to the present veterans, we can certainly try can. There are other places we can look to try to find info, but it gets pretty tricky. Yes, sir.
So if you don't have World War II, I understand you don't have World War II, but if they burned at the center in St. Louis or wherever, how are you going to, I mean, what records would you get that would help recreate that? And would we be, are those records we'd have access to through some other arm of the National Archives or something?
Yeah, so that's the state records is what you want to do, okay? So you want to go to the State Department of Veterans Affairs, or you want to go to the County Register of Deeds.
Okay, and then they only have the one discharge?
Most likely, yes.
Wilson
Yeah.
Bunch's brother.
Pat, go ahead. Pat, go ahead.
Question.
We have one more right here. Yeah, Mark, yeah. Pat, right here.
Could you check the name Muchler? He would have been a World War I veteran. Whether he'd be in the archives or not, I don't know.
Can you spell that last name for me?
Mutchler.
We have a bunch of Muchlers. Yeah, what's his first name?
You could try Wilson.
So here's Wilson Muchler right here.
Yeah.
So yeah, it looks like we would have information. He served in the 131st Infantry. So if you want to either email me or call me, or you can go to our website and find him and click on this Request More Info tab. So we would have a World War I service record for this gentleman that would tell more about his service.
There's a road named after him here in Fitchburg.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's cool. Any other questions?
Kind of a general question, because the long-lost relative was from Illinois, but he served in the Indian Uprising as kind of a volunteer in southern Minnesota, and was killed. Any suggestions on where to dig up information on him?
So did he serve in an Illinois unit?
Not sure of that.
Okay. So what I point would be to kind of work backwards and try to find out where he's buried. Look on his headstone. A lot of times military headstones will list a unit. But for this, you're talking about the Civil War. Correct. Yep. We'd love to make a World War II database, but we don't have access to the records yet. What you really want to unfortunately. Now that being said, if you have questions about World War II to the present veterans, we can certainly try. There are other places we can look to try to find info, but it gets pretty tricky. Yes, just a little more info about what happened to him. And I think going through, or if you use Ancestry.com, they often have applications for veterans, headstones. Like, there's a couple you could look, and feel free to email me because I can give you some suggestions. But the key piece of information to find is the unit that he served in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
For Civil War, if you have an ancestor you know served, and it's a German last name, and you think you found the person who it's written, but you don't know how to prove that that's your person. How do you do that?
Well, that will usually involve other resources too. So if you find someone in our database and you're pretty sure that's them, the first thing would be to look at their muster and descriptive role. That'll at least give you a little more information. So that will list the age he was at enlistment, which isn't the same as a birth date, but it at least puts you in the ballpark. So that would be the first step. Like, does this seem like it could be the right guy based on his age? And then if it is, I would probably recommend using Ancestry.com and census records. So if you search for his name and his date of birth, we're getting into details here, but yeah, I'd try Ancestry. So if you want to either email me or call me, or you can go to our website and find him and click on this Request More Info tab. So we would have a World War I service record for this gentleman. That
If
more
anyone
about his
else
service.
has questions, you could come up after we adjourn, and let's give Russ a hand for his.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.